The big news this week, Martin, other than the Iranian Revolutionary Guard being supposedly a terrorist organisation, according to Pompeo, is yesterday's rather sad arrest of Julian Assange, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Assange is important because it's basically an attempt to shut him up and to shut other people up, who, like us, for example, who tell truth to power.
But Assange has done, I think, probably more than we have to get some of this information out to the public, including all sorts of manuals to spyware, for example, so that those who computer geeks, etc., can see what might be lurking on computers. A lot of this spyware, of course, has been developed by our own government, sometimes by the private security industry, contracted to our government or the National Security Agency in the US.
Well, yes, and you saw the book that Assange was holding when he was dragged out of the embassy. It was Gore Vidal's book about the deep state in the US. I don't think it's called deep state, but that's what's been going on for years. We haven't really got a democracy. We've got an oligarchy which suppresses inconvenient information. And
I was surprised, though.
Assange is in the crosshairs.
I was surprised, though, that the commentary really didn't talk much about what he was saying as he came out of the embassy. Saying the UK must resist, the UK must resist, and then something about the Trump administration, pretty obviously saying he doesn't want to be extradited and the UK must stand up for him, which maybe we will. And so let's have a listen to him now. I mean, they didn't really do this on any of the mainstream broadcasts I saw in the UK.
UK must resist! UK resist!
UK must resist. UK resist.
UK must resist.
So ultimately, he's been through an enormous number of revelations over the years, Martin, hasn't he? Really starting, I suppose, most spectacularly with the release of the footage of USM and actually murdering a whole load of Reuters cameramen in Iraq.
Yes, and that is, I understand that the extradition proceedings, which for many years they were told there were no extradition proceedings, and it was all just paranoia by Assange, and it turns out, of course, that there were extradition proceedings, and now we know, and it's out in the open. What he's been saying for years is true. Yes, they do want to extradite me.
Iraq and Afghan war logs, extremely important. I think what I'll do is I'll put a graphic up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk about this. But, I mean, this is a whole load of military war logs from the Pentagon and backwards and forwards to commanders and politicians about the Afghan war and the Iraq war.
Yes, and
this is unprecedented. I think it's unprecedented in history that so much has been released in this way.
Indeed, and of course a lot of it was picked up by the mainstream media, the New York Times, etc., the Guardian, the BBC. So why aren't all these people being arrested and taken, dragged off to court? And that's because they're
what they're trying to accuse Assange of is being a hacker, but actually he was receiving leaked information.
Right.
So
that's right, he's not a hacker. And of course, one of the fundamental things which is which this, you know, an arrest like this gives us a chance to say, well, what is it that he's actually said? Because I think that's the most important thing. When freedom of speech is under attack, you should immediately say, well, what are they saying that they don't want us to hear?
OK, so we mentioned the collateral murder video, which captured US indiscriminate slaying of civilians. That was back in 2010.
Which was Chelsea Manning's leak, wasn't it?
Yes, and they're saying that both he and Chelsea Manning, this is what they're trying to say anyway, conspired to hack a computer. Well, I mean, that's really just simply not true.
No, it's not. I mean, Chelsea Manning was the leaker, and in a sense, the government's got to leak. You know, they have Official Secrets Acts and so on to protect. Insiders aren't supposed to leak if they've signed Secrecy Acts and so on.
Then we had 2010, 2011. We had over that winter something called Cablegate, which is US diplomatic cables revealing corruption worldwide. Things like kicking off the Tunisian revolution. I mean, these are really important geopolitical matters.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, yes, and of course, probably more essential in geopolitical terms is the emails from the Democratic National Committee.
No, we'll get in there in a minute, yeah? So let's just take it. We're doing a timeline here, right?
We'll do the
in 2011, we had something called the Gitmo files, which is revealing of torture of prisoners and deaths due to mistreatment and, basically, the torture files. They call it the Gitmo files. That was in 2011.
Yeah. And of course, the point, as you made it earlier, this is not hacked information. This is leaked information. So insiders pass the information to Wikileaks. Wikileaks check whether it's real, and then redacted let it out so that people can see what's going on behind the scenes. And of course it paints a very different picture from the official stories. There is torture going on. The people at the top knew torture was going on. They approved of torture. They tortured people. They are torturers.
What's wrong with that? Surely that's just the way away in the modern world.
It's illegal. And everybody involved in it could be prosecuted and sent to prison.
OK, in 2016, Operation Sophia was one of the WikiLeaks. You know, it's amazing. I was just looking through the list, and what we forget is incredible. This was the NSA spying on world leaders and citizens, a whole load of evidence that this is going on. I mean, we're talking about all around the world. If I remember rightly, part of this was looking at the way that the Germans spy on the British and the British spy on the Germans, even though we're supposed to be in some sort of alliance. But to actually be able to read some of these intel reports is fascinating.
Yes, and of course they don't like their modus operandi being exposed in this way, and it makes it difficult for them to carry on doing what they're doing. But of course a lot of what they're doing, and I come back to this, a lot of what they're doing has no legal basis, and things which have no legal basis are illegal, just like Gladio, which we're going to come to later in the show.
That makes them criminals, doesn't it?
That makes them all criminals, which means that they're all open to prosecution.
But also,
and that's what could happen.
Also,
a new generation is coming into political consciousness now. A lot of these people from the previous generation could end up in prison.
Spying on civil society leaders, that sort of thing, and ordinary citizens who are part of these groups. So if you simply literally go down the road and you're trying to do, you have a meeting in a pub, you're thinking about doing some campaign to stop some motorway or whatever it is you happen to be doing, the NSA are there, apparently.
Yes, and of course what's pretty obvious is that before the advent of modern computers, collecting all of this information was rather pointless because you just have great big piles of stuff that you couldn't possibly analyse. Whereas what they've got now with computers is that mass surveillance of the population becomes absolutely feasible, and they're engaged in it. And they're engaged in it because they want to manipulate the population to make war and to steal other people's resources.
This is, in a way, isn't it, what was being prosecuted at Watergate? The idea that the secret services would then start interfering in civil society and people's ability to actually campaign on political issues, to spy on them in order to stop campaigns before they've even got started, for example.
Well, indeed, and of course you'd be pretty naive not to know that that's been going on for a very long time. And of course the idea that we used to live in a democracy and then it was taken away from us is rather pointless.
What WikiLeaks has done is it's provided the hard evidence for what for years were conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Then we get to your bit, which is 2016, the DNC emails. Really important, this. The pro-Clinton media bias exposed. So discussions between the Clinton campaign and heads of the US media, making sure that they present Hillary Clinton in a good light in order to win her the presidential election.
It was the Democratic primary.
Yeah.
The Democratic primary.
And also the revelation of the scheme to push Bernie Sanders out of the presidential race.
Yes, in other words, and this is very significant because nobody disputes what's in these emails. Not the FBI, not the CIA, not anybody. They all say that these emails show that the Democratic primaries were rigged to prevent Bernie Sanders from being the candidate. And of course, if you've got an official two-party system in the US, rigging one of the party's internal primaries is basically rigging the whole system. Now, everybody admits that this is very damaging to the vision of America as a democratic society, and that what the FBI and CIA have been saying is that is so damaging that it must be Russian intelligence that did this. Now, it isn't Russian intelligence that rigged the primary. It was the DNC National Committee working with the oligarchy and the CIA.
Okay, so what was Julian Assange's role then?
Well, Julian Assange was passed the information about all of this, the emails, and of course it was actually picked up by Craig Murray, who flew to the US to pick up the information.
But I think they denied him entry when he first arrived, and he had to get a second flight, didn't he?
That's right. And they've said all along that we didn't get this stuff from the Russians. And it's not a hack anyway, it's a leak. It was given to us on an MP3 stick, not something that we had to hack into a computer to get.
Okay, so...
And of course what it shows is that US politics is rigged, not by the Russian intelligence services, but by the US intelligence services. And if Bernie Sanders had been the candidate against Donald Trump in the election, he might well have won. In that case, there can't have been a lot of people sent to prison.
Okay, in 2017, WikiLeaks did what I thought was one of their most mind-blowing leaks, which was called Vault 7. Documents specify CIA spy toolkit, surveillance and cyber warfare. Now, this includes things like the ability to hack into vehicles, including cars, actually implanting spyware into your car's computer using an innocent-looking compact disc. Say, for example, you put it into your CD player, and as soon as it goes in there, what happens is it links up parts of the car's computer, which are not supposed to be linked, so that then the car can be just literally taken over remotely and steered, if necessary, into a brick wall at full speed.
Like Michael Hastings, the journalist who was investigating David Petraeus and the CIA.
Now, also
then just crashed into a wall at 90 miles an hour.
I mean, it's not just cars; it's other forms of transport that can be hacked, including things like trains and aircraft.
And also electricity substation systems, like in Venezuela the other week, which pretty much clearly was carried out by these kind of forces who wrecked the electricity generation system in Venezuela.
I mean, there's so much in the Vault 7, it's well worth it. And actually, what I will do is I'll put a link up on our show page again to the whole Vault 7 link, because as I remember it, I think it's the Sydney Morning Herald did a fantastic graphic on all the things that were revealed in that one data dump by WikiLeaks. And that is the use of televisions to spy on people. So in hotels, in your home, when you switch the TV off or on standby, actually it's still live and the microphone is transmitting information about anything that anyone in the room is saying. So this wasn't known about. This sort of stuff was suspected, but this gives hard evidence that this is going on all over the world now.
Yes, and of course the powers that be that are doing all these nefarious things don't want people to know about it, which is why they're throwing the book at Assange, to intimidate others, basically. I mean, you know, a lot of Assange's material had ended up, as I say, in mainstream publications, BBC, Guardian, New York Times, but none of those people are being prosecuted. And that's because there's a lot of manipulation going on. And, of course, sometimes the leaks are manipulated as well. You know, we can't just presume that because something has been leaked, it's been leaked for a decent purpose. There may be other ulterior motives involved. OK,
well, anyway, the Home Secretary, Sajid, Javid, did have something to say about this yesterday in the House of Commons.
This morning, after nearly 7 years inside the Ecuadorian Embassy, Mr. Assange was arrested for failing to surrender in relation to his extradition proceedings. He was later also served with a warrant for provisional arrest, pending receipt of a request for extradition to stand trial in the United States on charges relating to computer offences. The Metropolitan Police entered the embassy for the purpose of arresting and removing him. All of the police's activities were carried out pursuant to a formal written invitation signed by the Ecuadorian ambassador and in accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The decision as to whether any statutory bars to extradition apply would be for the UK courts to determine. I will go no further in discussing the details of the accusations against Mr. Assange, either in the UK's criminal justice system or in the US. Mr. Assange will now have the opportunity to contest the charge against him in open court and to have any extradition request considered by the judiciary.
Well, I personally, as a British taxpayer, I resent spending millions of pounds to keep Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. All he asked to do was be allowed to go to Ecuador when Correa was the president, and of course Moreno has basically betrayed his mandate, and Correa has basically been very
because Assange's detractors have said, well, he could have walked out any time, but of course he couldn't.
No, he couldn't. And what he said was, they gave him citizenship, and they said, well, can't we just take him to Ecuador? And they said, no, he's got to stay here. So, in other words, the British courts and the British police have spent millions, literally millions, 7 years they've been staking that embassy out, with all police on overtime pay, no doubt. Meanwhile, we've got an austerity programme, which means that kids come to school without enough to eat, but we've got money to spend on this to keep the Americans happy and their Israeli overlords, because that's what we're really talking about here.
OK, so Diane Abbot, the Shadow Home Secretary, had this to say.
The reason we are debating Julian Assange this afternoon, even though the only charge he may face in this country is in relation to his bail hearings, the reason we are debating this afternoon is entirely to do with the whistleblowing activities of Julian Assange on Wikileaks. It is this whistleblowing activity into illegal wars, mass murder, murder of civilians and corruption on a grand scale that has put Julian Assange in the crosshairs of the US administration. Julian Assange is not being pursued to protect US national security. He is being pursued because he has exposed wrongdoing by US administrations and their military forces. And we only have to look at the treatment of Chelsea Manning to see what awaits him if he's extradited to the US.
Well, I'm glad to hear that Diane Abbot's saying those things, and clearly the Tory government is going to try and press the case that Assange is a wicked man and we've done the right thing here. In actual fact, he's going to get some pretty top lawyers, I can imagine, and it's quite clear that he shouldn't be extradited to the US at all, because what he's done is not a crime, and he's not even a US citizen. He's an Australian citizen, and he didn't carry out any of these crimes in the US. So in actual fact, they haven't got a leg to stand on. He should basically just be allowed to go home to Australia. That's what should happen here.
Well, it's nice to see, actually, that the National Union of Journalists also says today, following UK police forcibly removing WikiLeaks founder Assange from the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. Seamus Dooley said the NUJ is shocked and concerned by the actions of the authorities today in relation to Julian Assange. He's the Assistant General Secretary. His lawyer has confirmed he's been arrested not just for breach of bail conditions, but also in relation to US extradition requests. He always feared this, didn't he?
Yes, and of course for years and years, the bien pensant media saying, he's just a narcissist. There's no extradition request. It's all to do with the rape allegations, blah blah blah. But of course it wasn't. It was all to do with they wanted to get him. And using parliamentary privilege in the US, people have actually called for him to be assassinated. Can you do that? Can you call for people to be assassinated? I suppose you can. They've got away with it. Is it legal?
I don't know. I don't know if that would breach the Ofcom guidelines, would it?
Well, I don't know. I'm just telling you that US politicians have openly called for him to be assassinated and for WikiLeaks to be treated as a foreign terrorist organisation similar to the
Martin,
Iranian Republican Guard.
One of the most fascinating things about this is that just 3 weeks ago, the International Monetary Fund approved a $4.2 billion loan to Ecuador. International Monetary Fund. It's part of a broader aid package to help support the government economic reform programme. Washington-based lender agreed to the terms of the financing late last month. The final approval of the IMF board on Monday releases the first instalment of $652 million. Actually, it seems that the IMF does this, doesn't it? And those countries' leaders who behave themselves get the loans, and in South Africa at the moment they're having a few problems with actually getting the IMF. They must be doing something the IMF don't like.
Well, I mean, also, of course, the IMF loan is actually to carry out IMF policy, and of course the Correa regime, and he won 2 terms, and of course the Ecuadorian constitution doesn't allow him to stand again, so Lenin Moreno, Lenin is his name because he was named by his dad after Lenin, was part of Correa's party. But what he's done is he's come to power, he's switched sides, and he's basically moving into the privatisation, deregulation. The Ecuadorian government has not been very supportive of the Venezuelan government, unlike, for example, the Bolivian government, which is still solidly behind Maduro. And Correa, who's actually left Ecuador, he's actually in exile. Moreno is actually being exposed for corruption. He was exposed for corruption by the New York Times. And, of course, he's blamed that on Assange, but Assange had nothing to do with that. WikiLeaks has never leaked anything about what goes on in Ecuador. So that's just a red herring. And basically, Moreno has betrayed his political base. He's betrayed his former comrade, Correa. And Correa, based outside Ecuador now, said that Moreno is a disgusting traitor to Latin America and to Ecuador. And that's the reality. And, of course, he is.
In the meantime, as well, we hear this week something called the online harms. There's more legislation in order to regulate what can and cannot be said online. So I would imagine that this is also an attempt, in fact, looking at some implication here, some of the rights groups have called this out, that what the government's online harms white paper may start to do is to stop people sharing anything which is a national security story which has been leaked. So it seems almost that Assange is being taken out of the way, and also his whole methodology of getting stuff out to the public which the mainstream press won't print is also being removed by this online harms policy.
Well, we shall see whether they can actually enforce that when it comes down to it. We all know that, intelligent teenagers can find their way around just about anything that you put in there to block them, and that's been true for a generation. And we shall see about that. And
there is actually this little thing about the internet, isn't there? It was designed as a nuclear war communication network, so that any damage in that network that the military could route around the damage. So if there's a hole in the network, and of course that works with censorship too, in a way, because if you try and censor the internet, it detects that censorship as damage and routes around it.
Yes, and of course attempts there were similar problems if you think back to the invention of printing in the 17th century, and then massive pamphlets, and the governments couldn't really control it. And the same's true of the internet. They can control it by closing it down completely, but then of course it's such an essential feature of modern society that you can't function without it. And if you've got to have it, then basically you've got to allow freedom of speech. But of course they are trying, by intimidating people like Assange, anybody else who was thinking that they might, want to leak something or press on some information, they are being told, we will come and get you and we'll make your life a misery. I think most people have admitted now that the whole Swedish attempt to indict Assange, which was a European arrest warrant, which hadn't even been charged. When they go on about there's an extradition, you can't extradite somebody unless there's been a charge. There was no charge.
Apparently under a European arrest warrant you could, just for it to be interviewed.
Well, I mean,
he hadn't actually been charged with this.
Well, he hadn't actually been charged with anything. In actual fact,
and also the girls were tweeting something, positive about him when just after apparently we'd had an alleged rape. So anyway, let's not go any further down that road. But let's have a listen now to the House of Commons, who were talking this week at Prime Minister's Questions about this new online harms legislation.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, some argue for completely free markets and self-regulation by big business, but this can lead to harmful content and extreme views being promoted. The tech giants who act as publishers have shown that they won't act without regulation. Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming the publication of the Online Harms White Paper and support the levelling of the playing field between print and broadcast media and the tech giants?
Can I say to my honourable friend, she's raised a very important point that I think matters to people up and down this country. The internet can be absolutely brilliant at connecting people and providing people with information and connecting people not just nationally but across the world. But for too long the companies haven't done enough to protect users, especially children and young people, from harmful content. And that's not good enough. And that's why we've listened to campaigners and parents. We're putting a legal duty of care on internet companies to keep people safe. And I would like to congratulate my right honourable friends, the Culture Secretary and the Home Secretary, for the work that they have done on this issue. Online companies must start taking responsibility for their platforms and help restore public trust in their technology.
I mean, of course, things like Facebook, Twitter, etc., Martin, they really are global, and it's very difficult for individual governments to regulate them, especially when they're suffering with austerity, that sort of thing. Isn't it a global thing that we need a global government to deal with?
Well, you'd need global conventions to deal with it, just as there were global conventions covering other things.
The thing is, the Chinese have dealt with it. The Chinese have dealt with it, haven't they? They've said you can't come into this country until you do X, Y, and Z. And of course, Google, the rest of them all bend over until they do.
Yes, and of course, there's some people who say that the Chinese government tries to control people's opinions and so on. But I bet you quite likely Chinese teenagers can always look at stuff they want to look at, whatever the government says. Nobody's going to stop it.
Actually, what happens, of course, I don't know if you know this, but the National Security Agency and others deliberately put out apps there which will allow them to get around their own government's censorship system. That certainly happened when I was over in Iran. Most of the young people had apps where they could use Facebook fine because it had some way of routing around things, so they could do it. But that was an app that had been developed over here.
Basically, obviously there are harmful things out there on the internet. There are harmful things going on in society. You know, child pornography is banned because it involves sexual acts with children being filmed, and therefore that's why it's banned. So that it's not so much the YouTube streaming of it that's the problem. It's the act itself which is illegal. And of course, it is illegal for that reason. And that's the way you go. But basically, the internet, like printing in the 17th century, has opened up ordinary people being massively. They've got a huge spectrum of opinions that they can now look into if they want to, and that's basically unstoppable. And attempts to try and close down the internet and things like Assange may be suffering badly now, and he may end up in prison in the US or worse. But the fact of the matter is, the stuff he's put out there is still out there, and it's great stuff, and people should look at it.
He's not the managing editor of Wikileaks anymore. There's a whole team behind him.
He's just pioneer. Basically, he's been treated as a scapegoat. But in actual fact, the stuff that they put out there, which we reviewed in the earlier part of this show, was worth knowing. And when they try and squash people like this, you've got to remind people, what is it they're taught that they're squashing here? What they're covering up the fact that they themselves are engaged in overtly criminal behaviour, killing, torturing, maiming, stealing. And
actually, what they're doing
is
what they're actually doing. Well, I'm not so sure nothing gets done about it. What they're doing effectively is abusing offices of state. So this is really what I guess you would call malfeasance. It's the deliberate use of public office in order to commit crime.
Yes, and it's been going on for a long time, but it's got worse. The idea that the CIA was pretty noxious in the 1960s, but the modern CIA have reformed, is for the birds. They were noxious in the 1960s, and they're even worse today.
Well,
and they're probably these organisations need to be completely smashed and disbanded, like the Russian KGB was.
Well,
in the 1990s.
I think John F. Kennedy tried to do that. What happened to him?
Well, we know what happened to him, Tony.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you will need to apply to the EU settlement scheme.